Vaccination proved useless and dangerous. From 45 years of registration statistics, Alfred R, Wallace, LL.D, to members of Parliament and others. 45 years of registration statistics, proving vaccination to be both useless and dangerous. In 2 parts, by Alfred R, Wallace, LL.D, 2nd edition, with corrections, notes, and an appendix by 𝗥𝗲𝘀𝗲, 1889. 45 years of registration statistics. Part 1. Smallpox mortality and vaccination. Having been led to inquire for myself as to the effects of vaccination in preventing or diminishing smallpox, I have arrived at results as unexpected as they appeared to me to be conclusive. The question is one which affects our personal liberty as well as the health and even the lives of thousands. It therefore becomes a duty to endeavor to make the truth known to all, and especially to those who, on the faith of false or misleading statements, have enforced the practice of vaccination by penal laws. I propose now to establish the following for statements of fact, by means of the only official statistics which are available. And I shall adopt a mode of presenting those statistics as a whole, which will render them intelligible to all. These statements are: 1. That during the 45 years of the registration of deaths and their causes, smallpox mortality has very slightly diminished, while an exceedingly severe smallpox epidemic occurred within the last 12 years of the period. 2. That there is no evidence to show that the slight decrease of smallpox mortality is due to vaccination. 3. That the severity of smallpox as a disease has not been mitigated by vaccination. 4. That several inoculable diseases have increased to an alarming extent coincidentally with enforced vaccination. The first, second, and fourth propositions will be proved from the Registrar General's reports from 1838 to 1882. And I shall make the results clear and indisputable by presenting the figures for the whole period in the form of diagrammatic curves, so that no manipulation of them, by taking certain years for comparison, or by dividing the period in special ways, will be possible. Deaths in England and Wales per million living from smallpox and from the chief other zymotic diseases except cholera. The diagrams show, in each case, not the absolute mortality, but the deaths per million living, a method which eliminates the increase of population and gives true comparative results. Vaccination has not diminished smallpox. Diagram 1 exhibits the deaths from smallpox in London for every year from 1838 to 1882. While an upper line exhibits the deaths from the other principal zymotic diseases given in the Registrar General's annual summary for 1882, except cholera, which is only an occasional epidemic, namely scarlet fever and diphtheria, measles, whooping cough, typhoid and other fevers, and diarrhea. A dotted line between these shows the mortality from fevers of the typhoid class. The first thing clearly apparent in this diagram is the very small diminution of smallpox corresponding with the epochs of penal and compulsory vaccination. While the epidemic of 1871 was the most destructive in the whole period, the diagrams in the first edition stopped at 1882. In this edition, the later years are added without variation of the text, which these later years do but accentuate. Complaint has been made of this presentment. It is the most accurate that can be made. The favorite method of averaging in such a manner as to take all the sharp lines from the curves totally obscures the epidemic nature of the disease of smallpox, its great characteristic feature. No truer presentment than that chosen can be adopted. The line of official vaccinations includes, for 6th May 1884, official re-vaccinations, which have not been given since 1872, or the fall would be much more pronounced for these years. Dead. From the Registrar General's Annual Summary of Deaths, etc., III, London, 1882. Table 23, page 𝗥𝗲𝘀𝗃. The average diminution of smallpox mortality from the first to the second half of the period is 57 deaths per million per annum. Looking now at the upper curve, we see that the mortality from the chief zymotic diseases has also decreased, more especially during the last 35 years. But the decrease of these diseases is not, proportionally, so great, owing to the fact that deaths from diarrhea have considerably increased in the latter half of the period. On the other hand, typhus and typhoid fevers have diminished to a much greater extent than smallpox, as shown by the dotted line on the diagram, the reduced mortality from this cause alone being 382 per million, or more than 6 times as much as that from smallpox. Everyone will admit that this remarkable decrease of typhus, etc., is due to more efficient sanitation, greater personal attention to the laws of health, and probably also to more rational methods of treatment. But all these causes of amelioration have certainly had their effect on smallpox. And as the mortality from that disease has not equally diminished, there is probably some counteracting cause at work. From 1838 to 1853, the average smallpox death rate exceeded that of the years 1854 to 1867 by 229 per million living. But the average of the years 1868 to 1886 exceeded that of the years 1854 to 1867 by 46 per million. The deaths from typhus, enteric, and fever, 1871 to 80, were less by 540 per million than in the 10 preceding years. The years I-88 to 1S86 show a further reduction, as compared with 1871 to 1880, of 125 per million living. Dead. So far, therefore, from there being any proof that vaccination has diminished smallpox in London, the tendency of the Registrar General's facts, and there are no other facts which are trustworthy, is to show that some counteracting cause has prevented general sanitation from acting on this disease as it has acted on typhus, and that cause may, possibly, be vaccination itself. We will now turn to diagram 2, which gives a representation of similar statistics for England and Wales, except that unfortunately there is a blank in the record for 1843 through 1846, in which years the Registrar General informs us the causes of death were not distinguished. Here too we perceive a similar decrease in smallpox mortality, broken by the tremendous epidemic of 1871, 1872, while the other chief zymotic diseases represented by the higher line show more irregularity, but a considerable recent decrease. From the Registrar General's Annual Report, 1882. Table 32, page 𝗥𝗲𝘀𝗃. For all England, as for London, the tables show us that typhoid fevers have decreased far more than smallpox. But for clearness the curve of typhus is omitted, and we have, therefore, again, no reason for imputing the decrease in smallpox to vaccination. But we may go further than this negative statement, for we have greater than fortunately a means of directly testing the alleged efficacy of vaccination. The 11th annual report of the local government board gives a table of the number of successful vaccinations at the expense of the PO rate in England and Wales from 1852 to 1881. From the figures of this table, I have calculated the numbers in proportion to the population of each year, and have exhibited the result in the dotted line on my diagram too. And to this I beg to direct the reader's attention, since it at once dispels some oft-repeated erroneous statements. I have examined every report of the local government board with the intention of giving the total vaccinations for the whole period embraced in this diagram too. But the total vaccinations are not tabulated and are only given in the text for the years since 1872. Hence the official vaccinations only appear here, with such vaccinations as are tabulated. Bed. In the first place, we see that, instead of vaccination having increased since the enforcement of penal laws, it has actually diminished. So that the statement so often made by official apologists for vaccination, and repeated by 𝗩𝗰𝗶𝘁𝗶cie in his speech to the House of Commons, June 1883, that the progressive efficiency of legal vaccination has diminished smallpox, is absolutely untrue, since there has been a decrease rather than an increase of efficient vaccination. It is curious that even the Registrar General appears to be ignorant of the fact that official vaccination has not increased in efficiency since the penal laws came into force. In his report for 1880, page XCI, he says, "These figures show conclusively that, coincidentally with the gradual extension of the practice OJ vaccination, there has been a gradual and notable decline in the mortality from smallpox at all ages. However, there has not been shown to have been any such gradual extension of the practice of vaccination, but, so far as official records go, just the reverse. The whole argument falls to the ground. It is true that this curve does not exhibit the numbers of the vaccinated population, which there is no means of arriving at. Mr. Mawson, the surgeon of the smallpox hospital, told the Select Committee, 1871, answer 4190, the public are pretty largely vaccinated now, and will be more so every year, I should think, as time goes on. There is one point which has not been very clearly brought forward this morning, and that is the increase of smallpox after vaccination year after year. When I first went to the hospital, 35 years since, from 1835, the admission of patients into the smallpox hospital was 44% of smallpox after vaccination. From 1845 to 1855, 64%. From 1855 to 1865, 78%. And during 1863 and 1864, S3 and 84%. Those are patients who have been vaccinated. The line of official vaccination in the diagram shows that Mr. Mawson was mistaken as to the amount of public vaccination, and that it was a larger incidence of smallpox among the vaccinated he was witnessing, not the result of extension of vaccination. Ed. A temporary increase in the number of vaccinations always takes place during an epidemic of smallpox, or when an epidemic is feared. But an examination of the curve of vaccination does not support the statement that it checks the epidemic. On careful inspection, it will be seen that on 3 separate occasions a considerable increase in vaccinations was followed by an increase of smallpox. Let the reader look at the diagram And note that in 1863 there was a very great number of vaccinations, followed in 1864 by an increase in smallpox mortality. Again, the number of vaccinations steadily rose from 1866 to 1869. Yet in 1870 to 71 smallpox mortality increased. And yet again, in 1876 an increase in vaccinations was followed by an increase of smallpox deaths. In fact, if the dotted line showed inoculation instead of vaccination, it might be used to prove that inoculation caused an increase of smallpox. I only maintain, however, that it does not prove that vaccination diminishes the mortality from the disease. During the panic caused by the Great Epidemic of 1871-1872, vaccinations rose enormously and declined as rapidly the moment the epidemic passed away. But there is nothing whatever to show that the increased vaccinations had any effect on the disease, which ran its course and then died out the other epidemics. It has now been proved from the only complete series of official records that exist. 1. That smallpox has not decreased so much or so steadily as typhus and allied fevers. 2. That the diminution of smallpox mortality coincides with a diminished, instead of an increased efficiency of official vaccination. 3. That one of the most severe epidemics of smallpox on record, within the period of accurate statistics, occurred after 33 years of official, compulsory, and penal vaccination. These three groups of facts give no support to the assertion that vaccination has diminished smallpox mortality. And it must always be remembered that we have actually no other extensive body of statistics on which to found our judgment. The utility or otherwise of vaccination is purely a question of statistics. It remains for us to decide whether we will be guided by the only trustworthy statistics we possess, or continue blindly to accept the dogmas of an interested and certainly not infallible body of professional men, who once upheld inoculation as strongly as they now uphold vaccination. Smallpox has not been mitigated by vaccination. It is often asserted that, although vaccination is not a complete protection against smallpox, yet it diminishes the severity of the disease and renders it less dangerous to those who take it. This assertion is sufficiently answered by the proof above given, that it has not diminished smallpox mortality. But more direct evidence can be adduced. The best available records show that the proportion of deaths to smallpox cases is the same now, although a large majority of the population are vaccinated, as it was a century ago before vaccination was discovered. 𝗤𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗰𝗄 in 1723. The London Smallpox Hospital reports, 1746-63. 𝗤𝗂𝗀𝗆𝗵𝗋, 1763. And 𝗩𝗂𝗀𝗆𝗀𝗃𝗀, 1779. Give numbers varying from 16-5 to 25-3 as the percentage of mortality among smallpox patients in hospitals, the average of the whole being 8%. Now for the epoch of vaccination. Mr. Mawson, 1836-51, and the reports of the London, Homerton, Deptford, Fulham, and Dublin smallpox hospitals, between 1870 and 1880, give numbers varying from 14 to 26 to 217 as the deaths percent of smallpox patients, the average being 18-5. And this, be it remembered, under the improved treatment and hygiene of the 19th as compared with the 18th century. These figures not only demonstrate the falsehood of the oft-repeated assertion that vaccination mitigates smallpox, but they go far to prove the very opposite, that the disease has been rendered more intractable by it. Or how can we account for the mortality among smallpox patients being almost exactly the same now as a century ago, notwithstanding the great advance of medical science and the improvements in hospitals and hospital treatment? The following authorities have been examined for the facts and figures of this section. 𝗑𝗲𝘀𝗃. During 18,066 cases and 𝗑𝗲𝗀𝗃 72 cases given in analyze at 𝗩𝗂𝗀𝗃𝗆𝗄𝗃 𝗩𝗂𝗀𝗃𝗆𝗃, Paris, 1806. Pages 112, 113. London smallpox hospitals 6,454 cases given in an account of the rise, progress, and state of the hospitals for relieving poor people afflicted with the smallpox, and for inoculation, appended to a sermon preached before the President and officers of the hospital by the Bishop of Lincoln. London, 1763. 𝗩𝗂𝗀𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃, 1779, Volume 2, Art. Inoculation Col. INP. Po. 5. Extract. From a general calculation, it appears that, in the hospitals for smallpox and inoculation, 75 die out of 400 patients having the distemper in die natural way. Total cases before vaccination, 24,994. Mr. Mawson, resident surgeon to the Smallpox and Vaccination Hospital, London, 5,652 cases. Given in the Blue Book on the History and Practice of Vaccination, 1857, Smallpox in the Army and Navy. Here we have a crucial test of the efficacy or uselessness of vaccination. Our soldiers and sailors are vaccinated and revaccinated in accordance with the most stringent official regulations. They are exceptionally strong and healthy men, in the prime of life, and if vaccination is of any use, smallpox should be almost unknown among them, and no soldier or sailor should ever die of it. They are in fact often spoken of as a perfectly protected population. Now let us see what are the facts. London hospitals, 1870 to 72, 14,808 cases. In the report of a committee of the managers of the Metropolitan Asylum District, July 1872, p. 5. London hospitals, 1876 to 80, 15,172 cases. In a letter to the Times of November 8, 1879, from W.F. Jebb, clerk to the Metropolitan Asylum District, Homerton, 5,479 cases. From the report of the committee, 1877, Deptford, 3,185 cases. From the report of the medical superintendent, 1881, Fulham, 1,752 cases. From the report of the medical superintendent, 1881, Dublin, 2,404 cases. From the annual report of the committee, 1880, total cases after vaccination, 48,451. The extracted figures and percentages have been all carefully verified, and the averages have been obtained by dividing the total number of deaths multiplied by 100 by the total number of cases. I have thought it best to leave these notes unaltered. They are not affected by more recent experience, excepting in this way, that the great extension of our hospital accommodation involves a much larger number of mild cases being admitted. Objection has been taken to 𝗤𝗄𝗯𝗆's figures. 𝗤𝗄𝗯, it must be remembered, was trying to induce people to accept artificial smallpox by inoculation, and he gives his figures to show the great fatality of smallpox taken in the ordinary way by infection. He would therefore certainly not err in making it too mild. The total experience of the Metropolitan Asylums Board, up to the issue of the last report to the managers, is given in the appendix. Ed. A return has been issued to the House of Commons, Smallpox Army and Navy, dated August 1884, giving the mean strength, the number of deaths from smallpox, and the ratio per thousand in each service for the 23 years 1860 to 82. An examination of this return shows us that there has not been a single year without 2 or more deaths in the Army, and only 2 years without deaths in the Navy. Comparing the return on vaccination, mortality, number 433, issued by the House of Commons in 1877, we find that, in the 23 years 1850 to 72, the latest there given, there were many years in which no adult smallpox deaths were recorded for a number of large towns of from 100,000 to 270,000 inhabitants. Liverpool had known in 3 of the years, Birmingham and Sunderland in 7, Bradford and Sheffield in 8, Halifax in 9, Dudley in 10, while Blackburn and Wolverhampton were each totally without adult smallpox mortality for 11 out of the 23 years. It is true that the cases are not strictly comparable, because for these towns we have only deaths of persons aged 20 and upwards given separately, whereas the ages of the Army and Navy ranged chiefly from about 17 to 45. But, considering the extremely unsanitary state of many of these towns, and their great preponderance in freedom from smallpox, there is clearly no room left for the alleged effect of vaccination in securing to our soldiers and sailors immunity from the disease. But let us now look at the averages for the whole series of years, as affording the best and only reliable test. On working these out carefully, I find the mean smallpox mortality for the 23 years to be, in the Army 82.96, which we make all 83 per million, and in the Navy 157 per million. Unfortunately, no materials exist for an exact comparison of these rates with those of the civil population. But with much labor I have made the best comparison I can arrive at. From the Census General Report, 1881, and the reports of the Registrar General for the same 23 years as are included in the Army and Navy return. The 45th report of the Registrar General, Tables 63 and 4, gives 25 smallpox deaths among 195,937 British merchant seamen in 1882. This is at the rate of 127 per million, against the above 157 for the Navy. We have no reason to believe that revaccination is common in the merchant service. In the Navy, therefore, the influence of revaccination appears to be hurtful rather than beneficial. Ed. I have been able to ascertain the smallpox mortality of males in England and Wales between the years 15 and 55, taken as best representing those of the 2 services, and the result is a mean smallpox death rate of 176 per million. It will be observed that this is but little more than the Navy mortality, though more than double that of the Army, and the question arises, to what is the difference due? And first, why is the smallpox mortality in the Navy nearly double that of the Army? The following are the data on which this calculation is founded. In the General Report of the last census, Table 14, page 89, the numbers of males at successive ages are given for the three last censuses, 1861, 1871, and 1881. By a simple calculation, it is found that the number of males of all ages is to that of males aged 15 to 55 in the proportion of 1 to 0.528. Table 4, p. 78, of the same census report, gives the male population for the middle of each of the 23 years included in the Army and Navy return. The mean of these numbers is 11,167,500, and this sum, multiplied by the factor 0.528, gives 5,896,500 for the average male population of the ages 15 to 55 for those years. From the tables of causes of death at different periods of life in the 23 successive reports of the Registrar General, 1860-1882, I have extracted the deaths from smallpox of males aged 15 to 55, the mean annual value of which is 1,041. And this number, divided by the number of millions in the corresponding population, 5 to 8,965, gives the death rate per million equal 176. The limit of age, 15 to 55, has been taken because the General Report of the Census of 1881, Table 40, gives, for the Army and Navy, 7,530 men over 45, and 28,834 under 20 years of age. The smallpox death rate for same ages, England and Wales, for the years 1850 to 1870, was only 109 per million. Supplement to 35th Report, Table 2, page 2. The enormous increase is due to the epidemic since 1870. Dead. The regulations as to revaccination are the same in both, and are in both rigidly enforced, and the men are pretty equal in stamina and general health. The cause must therefore be in the different conditions of life of the two services, and it seems to me a probable supposition that the difference arises chiefly from the less efficient ventilation and isolation which are possible on board ship as compared with Army hospitals. The general mortality of the Navy from disease appears to be considerably less than that of the Army, so that the greater mortality from smallpox must be due to some special conditions. But whatever these are, the conditions of the civil population are certainly much worse. 2/3 of the families inhabiting Glasgow live in houses of 1 or 2 rooms only, and many other towns, including London, are probably not much better. An officer of the Royal Marine Artillery, of great experience, confirms this view. He assures me that isolation is absolutely impossible on board a ship of war. But if this is the explanation of the phenomenon, it is itself a proof of the complete inefficacy of revaccination, which not only does not protect men from catching smallpox, but allows them to die of it quite as much as, and allowing something for the superiority of sanitation, even more than the adult civil population, only partially vaccinated and hardly ever revaccinated. Under such conditions, and with the low vitality induced by insufficient food, overwork, and bad air, we should expect the smallpox mortality of our civil population to be very much greater than that of the picked class of sailors who enjoy ample food, fresh air, and medical attendance. Where then is the alleged full security afforded by revaccination? And how are we to characterize the statements circulated at the expense of the public, that smallpox is almost unknown in the Army and Navy. If we are to draw a legitimate conclusion from the facts, it is that the revaccination to which our soldiers and sailors are subjected renders smallpox more fatal when it attacks them. For thus only can we explain the large mortality among picked healthy men under constant medical supervision and living under far better sanitary conditions than the mass of the civil population. The following are a few of these assertions. The italics are to call attention to the essential words of each statement. The Lancet of March 1, 1879, says, "Vaccination needs to be repeated well once in a lifetime, and then the immunity is almost absolute." The medical officer of the General Post Office says, in a circular dated June 1884, "The only means of seeming protection against smallpox is by revaccination. It is desirable, in order to obtain full security, that the operation should be repeated at a later period of life." In the tract on smallpox and vaccination issued by the National Health Society, and now being widely circulated at the expense of the ratepayers, with the sanction of the local government board, we find this statement: every soldier and sailor is revaccinated. The result is that smallpox is almost unknown in the Army and Navy, even amid surrounding epidemics. The above statements are proved by the official returns now issued to be absolutely untrue, and must have been ignorantly and recklessly made without any adequate basis of fact. One other mode of comparison can be made, showing that even the Army smallpox death rate is but little better than that of some large towns. During the same period, the rate per million for the adult population, between the ages 15 and 55, on an average of the years 1860 to 82 for 5 very large towns was as follows. Of course, there are many other towns which have a much higher mortality, but very few are much worse than the Navy. These figures have been thus obtained. The Registrar General's Summary, 1882, gives the smallpox deaths per 1,000 for 20 great towns for the years 1872 to 82. The Parliamentary Return, Vaccination, Mortality, 1877, gives the smallpox mortality and population of a considerable number of towns for the years 1847 to 72. From these two official papers, the smallpox mortality per million of the whole male population from 1860 to 1882, for such towns as occur in both the tables, is easily obtained. The average smallpox death rate for all England is found to be 211.7, while that of the ages 15 to 55 is 176. These numbers are in the proportion of I to 83. Hence the total smallpox mortality of any town multiplied by the factor 0.83 will give, approximately, the mortality at ages 15 to 45. The proportion has been obtained from males only, but that of the two sexes combined will not be materially different. The very worst large town which I can find in the reports is Newcastle-on-Tyne, which for the same period had an adult smallpox mortality of 349 per million. But the fact that 5 of our most populous towns have considerably less adult smallpox mortality than the Navy, and one of them but little more than the Army, amounts to a demonstration of the uselessness of the most complete revaccination. The general mortality of our adult population is much greater than that of the Army and Navy. From the official sources of information already quoted, I find that the average mortality of the adult male population of England, of the ages 15 to 25, for the years 1860 to 82, was about 11,300 per million. That of the Navy, for the same period, was 11,000 per million from all causes, and only 7,150 from disease. That of the Army, at home, was 10,300 per million. Abroad it was nearly double, 19,400, but this included all the deaths from casualties, exposure, etc. in the Abyssinian, Afghan, Zulu, Transvaal, and other petty wars. Taken from page 𝗤𝗄𝗅, 45th report of the Registrar General, ed. Thus the superior physique of our soldiers and sailors, together with the sanitary conditions under which they live, are fully manifested in a mortality from disease much below that of the adult civil population of comparable ages. If we make the same allowance for the influence of these causes in the case of smallpox, there remains absolutely nothing for the alleged protective influence of revaccination. Surely we shall now hear no more of the revaccinated nurses in smallpox hospitals, as to whom we have no statistics, but only vague and usually inaccurate assertions, when we have a great, officially recorded experiment to refer to, extending over 23 years and applied to more than 200,000 men, the results of which directly contradict every professional and official statement as to the safeguard of revaccination. Vaccination itself a cause of disease and death. As has been now shown, vaccination is quite powerless either to prevent or to mitigate smallpox. But this is not all, for there are good grounds for believing that it is itself the cause of much disease and serious mortality. It was long denied by medical men that syphilis can be communicated by vaccination. But this is now universally admitted, and no less than 478 cases of vaccine syphilis have already been recorded. But there is also good reason to believe that many other blood diseases are transmitted and increased by the same means, since there has been for many years a steady increase of mortality from such diseases which is terrible to contemplate. The following table gives the increase of 5 of these diseases from the Registrar General's Annual Report for 1880, page 66, table 34, and it is very noteworthy that, in the long list of maladies there tabulated, no others, except bronchitis, which often follows vaccination though not, probably, transmitted by it, show any such striking and continuous increase, while the great majority are either stationary or decreasing. See Mr. Tebb's Compulsory Vaccination in England, p. 25, note, for a list of the authorities for these cases. Annual deaths in England per million living. We here see a constant increase in the mortality from each of these diseases, an increase which in the sum of them is steady and continuous. It is true, we have not, and cannot have, direct proof that vaccination is the sole cause of this increase, but we have good reason to believe that it is the chief cause. In the first place, it is a 𝗣𝗂𝗀𝗃𝗃, since it directly inoculates infants and adults, on an enormous scale, with whatever blood disease may exist unsuspected in the system. This table has not been continued in later reports, but we find that cancer, the only disease of the 5 separately tabulated, goes on steadily increasing, the mortality for the 5 years, 1881 to 85, being given in the 48th report as follows. syphilis 92, cancer 544, smallpox for the same period was 78. Bed of the infants from whom the vaccine virus is taken. In the next place, no other adequate cause has been adduced for the remarkably continuous increase of these special diseases, which the spread of sanitation, of cleanliness, and of advanced medical knowledge should have rendered both less frequent and less fatal. The increased deaths from these 5 causes, from 1855 to 1880, exceed the total deaths from smallpox during the same period, so that even if the latter disease had been totally abolished by vaccination, the general mortality would have been increased, and there is much reason to believe that the increase may have been caused by vaccination itself. It has been boldly asserted by the government department controlling vaccination that even if some children are killed by vaccination, 12,000 lives are annually saved by it. The basis of that assertion is an estimate which contradicts the official vaccination returns at almost every point. The estimate and assertion are false to the facts which are obtainable. The above-noted estimate is taken to prove that 94% of London children under 10 years of age are vaccinated, and that 95% of the population are vaccinated. This statement is further assumed to be supported by an examination of 53,185 children in various national, charitable, and parochial schools and workhouses in London. Such is the odious rigor of vaccine regulations in our national, charitable, and parochial workhouse schools, that I should not have been surprised if, of these children, not one was found unvaccinated. The parents of these poor children have had no one to defend them by paying fines for neglect of the vaccination. Yet this inspection showed 6% to have no vaccination scar, or to be doubtful as to vaccination. It is on such bases that tremendous statements, such as that noted above, are founded. And to shade off the impudence of this one, it is further declared that the estimate of the number of the unvaccinated is probably too high. Our responsible ministers have been appealed to respecting such a base use of official reports, and have had the humor to refer the objector to the very officials who have so degraded their department of the public service. These, in turn, when appealed to, refer to the head of the department. Meanwhile, the full statement is repeatedly quoted and stands as first used. The reports of the local government board show that only once have there ever been more than 87% of the births of the county vaccinated, and in London 3 or 4% fewer. The last year reported, 1886, gives 30,000 fewer official vaccinations than 1877, when it was over 86% of the births. The plan of the officials is to get 94% vaccinated by deducting the infants who died unvaccinated from the total births and treating the rest as surviving. I know no more condemnable trick. Death is as busy with vaccinated as with unvaccinated children. Ed.